What's up, I'm Ijemma and welcome back to my channel. I've been working on this API now for a minute and I'm glad with all the progress that is being made on the project, but when I take a step back and look at what the objective is for all the work that's been done, it's not as clear as I would like it to be. So I decided I should try to create a little static page that describes the objective and provide some extra information about the project so that people who don't want to be contributors to the source code can still look at this homepage and get a good sense of why this project exists. So with all that being said, in this video I want to show you the solution that I had to take on to create a static site that's actually served through the API. So I had to create a server-side rendered site. Before we jump into the contents of this video, a little disclaimer is that this isn't a full-blown tutorial on how to perform server-side rendering. If you're not too familiar with bundling, building, or deploying sites, I suggest that you do a little bit more research, watch a couple of videos before you watch this video, because I'm assuming that you have some basic low-level knowledge on the topics that I'm about to cover. The main point of this video is to act as a form of inspiration. Hopefully it can guide you down a path of understanding server-side rendering for your own projects. So with all that being said, in this video I want to show you how I took advantage of Next.js and Tailwind CSS to serve a server-side rendered site from the API. Since this isn't a tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how I like to think about server-side rendering for this project. So inside Igbo API we have our source folder, and inside this folder we have our server.js file, which is responsible for defining all the routes that are available to users and developers. In the last video I talked about serving a Swagger generated site for docs using the Swagger UI serve middleware and the Swagger UI setup function. So whenever a user hits the docs route, the API is going to serve up the Swagger docs site. So we want to take that same approach of when a user requests a certain route, we're actually going to serve up an entire site to them. So we can see that happening on line 49. If a user makes a GET request to the root route for our API, we're going to send over an index.html file. And you can see that our index.html file lives inside of our dist directory, which lives inside of our build directory. But now we have to answer the question of where does the build directory come from in the first place. So if we go into our Package.json file, we can answer that question. So we have 3 different build scripts that currently exist inside of this JSON file. So the build script is responsible for deleting our build folder that already exists and then rebuilding that build folder by placing all of our source code files inside of that new directory. After that, the script is responsible for calling the 2 other build scripts, which are build dictionaries and build site. Build dictionaries is responsible for taking all of our local dictionary JSON objects and placing them inside of our build folder. And then we can see where the magic really happens for our server-side rendered site. We're using the build site script, which uses Next to build the site, and then we also tell Next that once we build our site, we want to place all of our site files inside of the build folder, and then inside of the build folder, inside of another folder called dist. So when we call yarn build, we generate a build folder that also generates a dist folder that has an index.html file that serves up our entire application. So we can see what the site would look like if we build our application and run it locally. So the first thing I want to do is run yarn build. And what this is going to do is delete the build folder, rebuild it, place all of our dictionaries in it, and also our site source code. And once we've successfully built our site, what we want to do is start a local instance of our database and start a local instance of our API. So you can see here that our server was able to start on port 8080. So this is what our site would look like. We have an Igbo API with a navbar, we have a little title here with some extra information, and as you scroll down you can see that there's different components to this single page. And we can walk through each of these components in detail by looking at the way that I've constructed this page with React. So this project uses Next.js, which requires that there's some form of structure to how you create your components and pages for your site. So I had to create a new pages directory that includes some extra React files. So the first file that Next.js looks at is the index.js file, which just includes us importing and exporting our app component. So we can actually look at our real application by looking at app.js. So inside of app.js, we can see that this is where the bulk of the site lives. We can see the title of our site, we're rendering our navbar, some extra paragraph information, and below that we can see each of our features and try it out sections being rendered out. We can actually take a closer look at the custom components that are responsible for different parts of the site. So first we can take a closer look at the navbar component. The navbar component is a separate component that makes it easy to just focus on the styling and the functionality for the navbar links. And you can see at the top of the file here that this is our navbar component. And the next component is card, which is just a visual component that's responsible for rendering a box with a box shadow and a title with a description. So we can see that being rendered here with each of these boxes being our card component that's responsible for rendering the title and a little description. And the last custom component is the demo component, which is a little playground that allows developers to see what kind of data they'll be getting if they ever decided to use this API for any of their projects. So we can see that happening down here under the try it out section. This entire section, including this input, the button, and this little JSON block, is the demo component. So the whole idea behind this section is that if I type in a word like cook, I can see what kind of requests I would be making if I was consuming the API, and if I press submit, I can see the different results of words that I would get if I made this request. And at the very bottom of the page, we have a link to the doc site. So using Next.js made the whole process of creating a custom site super easy, but what I really wanted to use for this project was Tailwind CSS. So I had to figure out how I could include Tailwind CSS in a server-side rendered Next.js site. So after doing a lot of sifting through Stack Overflow threads and watching a ton of YouTube videos on how to configure a Tailwind CSS and Next.js project, this is what I came up with that works with the API. So I had 3 different config files that I had to include into this project for Tailwind to work with Next. The first config file is the Tailwind config file itself. This is like auto-generated and I didn't make any changes to it, so I don't even think I really need this config file in the project, but it makes me feel more comfortable that it exists in the first place. After that config file, I have a PostCSS config file, which is just exporting an object that has a plugins key, which is an array of imports, and I'm importing the Tailwind CSS and auto prefixer npm packages. So in order for this whole setup to work, you have to run a yarn add and then Tailwind CSS and auto prefixer, along with yarn installing the PostCSS package as well. And then lastly, I have my Next.js file, which is exporting some configuration information like where I want my dist folder to live, which is inside of build. And then I'm generating my build ID, which is just going to be called API homepage. I wrapped this entire object inside of the with CSS function that comes from Zate Next.CSS, which is the officially approved CSS plugin for Next.js, and hooking it up with CSS libraries like Tailwind. So when I call with CSS and pass in my next config object, I now have the ability to use Tailwind in my project. So inside of styles.css, I use the Tailwind directive to include base components and utilities, which allow me to use the Tailwind class names inside of my React components. And the very last step of setting up Tailwind CSS with Next.js is that Next out of the box doesn't allow you to import custom styles at the very top level of your application. So to overwrite that functionality, you have to create a new file called _app.js, where you are just re-exporting your entire app. But before you do that, you import your custom CSS file. So in this case, I'm importing styles.css. And once I do that, now my entire application has the ability to use the Tailwind CSS class names, which makes styling and making responsive designs so much easier. So after hours and hours and hours of playing around with different config options and different config files and seeing what kind of builds worked best for this project, this is how we're able to server-side render the API homepage. If you have any questions about this whole config process, because there are some tiny details and tweaks I had to make for it to work for this API, please let me know down in the comment section below, because this took me forever to figure out. But that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned something new. Hopefully you learned something new about Next.js, configuring it with Tailwind CSS, or just performing server-side rendering. If you want to contribute to the Igbo API, there is a link down in the description box that allows you to create issues, look at the issues, talk about anything about the project, and anything in between. I'm also on Twitter, where you can reach out to me and ask me questions about JavaScript, the API, or anything related. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one.